I'm Aldrich McGrath, 42, a military historian who spent 15 years collecting my father's war stories before he passed. My daughter Emma always rolled her eyes when I'd share them at family dinners. "Dad's war stories are boring," she'd say, dismissing the sacrifices that built our family's foundation. I accepted her indifference, thinking youth simply couldn't appreciate such history. Then I discovered the recordings on her husband David's phone, intimate conversations with his secretary, planning their weekend getaways, while Emma worked double shifts to support his struggling business. The betrayal cut deep, but what shattered me was hearing him mock our family's legacy, calling my father's Purple Heart old man's junk and my stories pathetic nostalgia. Emma deserved to know the truth about her husband, but she also needed to understand the strength that ran in her blood, the same courage that would help her face what was coming. The Purple Heart sat in its velvet-lined case on my desk, catching the afternoon light streaming through my study. Window 3. Bronze oak leaf clusters adorned the rib beneath, one representing another act of valor my father had downplayed as just doing my job. I traced the profile of George Washington embossed on the medal, remembering the weight of it in my 8-year-old hands when Dad first showed it to me. Emma used to love hearing about Grandpa's adventures. I whispered to the empty room, my voice catching on the past tense. She'd sit cross-legged on this same carpet, eyes wide as saucers, as I recounted how her grandfather had dragged 3 wounded soldiers to safety during the Battle of the Bulge, how he'd held a bridge for 6 hours with nothing but a rifle and sheer determination, how he'd written letters home to my mother between artillery barrages, promising to return to build the life they'd dreamed of. But somewhere around her 15th birthday, those same stories became eye-roll territory. "Dad, you've told us this a million times," she'd say, already reaching for her phone. The transition broke something in me I'd never quite acknowledged. My life's work preserving these memories, understanding their significance, had become background noise to my own daughter. David had accelerated that distance. I saw it now with crystal clarity. The way he'd changed the subject whenever I started sharing family history. How he'd schedule important calls during our Sunday dinners, pulling Emma away from conversations about her grandfather's courage. The subtle comments about living in the past and focusing on what matters now. What matters now? The phrase echoed in my mind as I picked up the Purple Heart, feeling its familiar weight. What mattered now was that my daughter was married to a man who mocked everything our family stood for while systematically betraying her trust. What mattered now was that she was working herself to exhaustion to support his lies. I closed the metal case and locked it in my desk drawer. Some battles, I was learning, required the same courage my father had shown on foreign soil. The enemy was different, but the stakes: protecting family, preserving honor, standing up to those who would destroy what you hold sacred, remained unchanged. Emma deserved better. She deserved the truth, and she deserved to remember the strength that flowed in her veins, even if she'd forgotten it existed. The military service record lay spread across my kitchen table like a roadmap of heroism. Form DD-214, discharge papers, commendation letters, the official documentation of my father's war service that I'd spent years collecting from the National Archives. But it was the handwritten letter from his commanding officer that always moved me most. "Sergeant McGrath displayed extraordinary valor under enemy fire," I read aloud, though I knew the words by heart. "His actions directly resulted in saving the lives of 8 fellow soldiers, in securing a strategic position that proved vital to the success of Operation Market Garden." I was 12 when Dad finally told me the full story behind that letter. We'd been fishing at Miller's Pond, just the 2 of us, when I asked why he kept changing the subject whenever Mom brought up the war. He set down his rod, stared out over the water for what felt like an eternity, then began to speak in a voice I'd never heard before. "War isn't like the movie, son," he'd said. "It's not about glory or being a hero. It's about the man next to you. When bullets start flying, you don't think about medals, or your country, or anything noble like that. You think about getting your buddy home to his wife, his kids, his mother who's praying for him every night." He told me about the bridge at Nice, how his squad had been pinned down by German machine gun nests for hours. How Jackson, barely 19, had been crying for his mother as blood soaked through his field dressing. How Williams, the comedian who kept everyone's spirits up, had gone quiet when shrapnel tore through his leg. "I didn't charge those gun positions because I was brave," Dad had continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I charged them because I couldn't listen to those boys die. Sometimes you do things that scare you more than death itself, because the alternative, living with yourself afterwards, scares you even more." That conversation changed everything for me. I understood then That the medals and commendations weren't trophies, they were testimonies. Evidence of moments when ordinary people found extraordinary strength because the stakes demanded nothing less. I'd tried to pass that understanding to Emma when she was young. She'd absorbed it then, asking thoughtful questions about her grandfather's motivations, wanting to understand how fear and courage could exist in the same moment. But adolescence brought skepticism, and David had nurtured that skepticism into outright dismissal. Now, looking at these documents through the lens of what I'd learned about David's betrayal, I saw the parallel more clearly than ever. My father had faced an enemy who threatened everything he held dear. The weapons were different. The battlefield was domestic rather than foreign. But the essential challenge remained the same. When someone you love is in danger, when your family's honor is under attack, when the cost of silence becomes greater than the cost of action, what do? I gathered the papers carefully, returning them to their protective folder. Emma needed to understand that the courage she'd inherited wasn't just historical curiosity. It was a living legacy, one she'd need to draw upon in the days ahead. The financial records I'd glimpsed on David's desk told a story that made my blood boil. While Emma worked double shifts at the hospital, pulling 16-hour days to keep their household afloat, David had been spending money on hotel rooms, expensive dinners, and gifts that never made it home to his wife. I'd noticed Emma's exhaustion months ago, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, the way she'd fall asleep during family movies, her head lolling against the couch cushion like a child who'd played too hard. When I'd ask about her grueling schedule, she'd brush off my concerns with the same phrase every time. David's business is just going through a rough patch. We need the extra income right now. The rough patch, I now realized, was entirely fictional. David's consulting business was thriving. I'd seen the invoices, the payments from multiple corporate clients, the healthy bank balance in his personal account. The account Emma knew nothing about. Apparently, based on her continued financial stress, he's really struggling. Dad, she'd told me just last month, declining my offer to help with their mortgage payment. It wouldn't be fair to take money from you when David's working so hard to turn things around. He's been putting in 18-hour days, meeting with potential clients, trying to rebuild after losing that big contract. Every word had been a lie wrapped in Emma's unwavering loyalty. While she'd been praising his work ethic and sacrifice, David had been meeting his secretary at the Marriott downtown, charging champagne dinners to the credit card Emma helped pay off with her overtime wages. The manipulation was so complete, so systematic, that I found myself reluctantly impressed by its scope. David had isolated Emma from family gatherings by scheduling emergency work calls during our dinners. He'd convinced her that her concerns about their relationship were symptoms of stress from her demanding job. He'd even turned her natural empathy against her, making her feel guilty for questioning his late nights and weekend business meetings. Most insidiously, he'd gradually eroded her connection to our family's values. Every time I'd start sharing a story about her grandfather's integrity, David would interrupt with comments about different times and modern realities. When I'd talk about the importance of honesty in relationships, he'd nod along while texting his mistress under the table. I'd watched my daughter, Ruman, who'd graduated summa cum laude from nursing school, who'd once talked about running for hospital administration, who'd inherited her grandfather's fierce sense of justice, slowly shrank into someone who apologized for taking up space in her own life. The woman who used to challenge my historical interpretations and offer sharp insights about human nature had been replaced by someone who prefaced every opinion with "David thinks" or "David says." The daughter who'd once stood up to bullies in middle school now flinched when her own husband raised his voice during what he dismissively called her emotional moments. But I'd seen flashes of the real Emma still burning underneath. The way her jaw tightened when David made snide comments about old people's stories. How her hands would clench when he'd answer his phone during family prayers. The flash of anger in her eyes when he'd criticized my antiquated views on loyalty and commitment. She was still in there. The granddaughter of a war hero, fighting to surface. She just needed someone to show her that the battle was worth fighting, and that she had allies ready to stand with her. Asterisk. The hotel receipt fell from David's jacket pocket as I helped Emma gather his dry cleaning from their car. $340 charge for a weekend at the Riverside Inn, dated 2 weeks ago, when he'd told Emma he was attending a business conference in Chicago. My hands shook as I palmed the paper, slipping it into my own pocket before Emma could see. But it was the voice recordings on his phone that shattered any remaining doubt about David's character. I'd only intended to check the time when his phone buzzed on their coffee table during Sunday dinner. The notification preview showed a message from Sarah's office, with enough visible text to make my stomach drop. Can't wait for Friday night. Make sure you bring my finger found the voice message thread, almost without conscious thought. Sarah's sultry laugh filled the tiny speaker as I held the phone to my ear, stepping quickly into the hallway. David, you're terrible, she giggled. In the first recording, telling your wife you're working late, when you're actually planning our weekend getaway. I've already booked a spa appointments couples massage, remember? And don't worry about Emma finding out. From what you've told me, she's too exhausted from those hospital shifts to notice much of anything. My vision blurred with rage, but I forced myself to listen to more. I still can't believe some of the things you've told me about her family. Sarah continued in another message. A Purple Heart recipient. Really? And she actually takes that seriously. You're right, it's like being married to a museum curator. All those dusty old stories about honor and sacrifice. Thank God you're nothing like that. I mean, who has time for all that vintage patriotism when there's real life to live? The next recording was David's voice, and every word felt like a physical blow. You should see her father's face when he starts telling those war stories, David said, his tone dripping with contempt. He actually tears up talking about his dad's medals. It's pathetic, really. All this worship of some old man's violence from 80 years ago. Emma used to eat it up too, when she was younger. Thank Christ I've helped her see how irrelevant all that nostalgia is to actual modern life. Sarah's laughter tinkled through the speaker. Poor Emma, trapped between a husband who's evolved beyond all that flag-waving nonsense, and a father who's stuck in 1944. No wonder she's always so tired. All that emotional whiplash must be exhausting. The funniest part, David continued, is how seriously they take themselves. Her grandfather's Purple Heart, Aldrich keeps it in this little shrine in his study, like it's the Holy Grail. 3 bronze leaves or whatever, representing acts of valor beyond the call of duty. I looked it up once. You know what it really represents? Bad luck. The guy got shot. Multiple times. Hardly something to build a family legacy around. I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. This wasn't just adultery, it was a systematic assault on everything my family held sacred. David wasn't simply cheating on Emma. He was actively working to destroy her connection to the values that had shaped generations of McGraths. Emma's starting to see things more clearly now, he continued in another message. She used to hang on every word when her dad would go into his little history lectures. Now she just nods politely and changes the subject as soon as she can. I've helped her understand that all that backward-looking hero worship is just a way of avoiding dealing with present realities. Present realities, the phrase echoed in my mind as I quickly forwarded the recordings to my own phone and deleted the evidence from David's message thread. The present reality was that my viewed my father's sacrifice as bad luck and my family's core values as vintage patriotism. The present reality was that he was systematically alienating my daughter from her heritage, while betraying her trust in the most fundamental way possible. But there was another present reality David hadn't counted on. Some traditions die hard, and the McGrath family tradition of protecting our own was very much alive. He'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating not just Emma's strength, but the depth of love and loyalty that connected 3 generations of our family. The war stories he found so tedious were about to become very relevant indeed. The combat photographs from my father's footlocker told stories that no medal could fully capture. Black and white images of young men who looked like boys, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion, staring into a camera lens with eyes that had seen too much. But it was the photo of Dad dragging Corporal Matthews to safety that always stopped me cold. I'd found these pictures after Dad's funeral, tucked beneath his Purple Heart in a cigar box he'd kept locked for decades. 23 photographs total, each one a frozen moment of hell survived. The one of him pulling Matthews showed my father's face in profile, jaw set with determination as he hauled his wounded comrade through what the accompanying note described as sustained enemy fire. Matthews had lost his leg that day, but he'd lived to walk his daughter down the aisle 30 years later. Dad had attended that wedding, sitting in the back row with tears streaming down his face as Matthews moved slowly but proudly down the aisle on his prosthetic. That's what it was all for, Dad had whispered to me afterward. Moments like this. Now, staring at that photograph, I understood the weight of the choice my father had faced. He could have stayed in that foxhole, kept his head down, waited for someone else to risk their neck for Matthews. It would have been the safer choice, the statistically smarter choice. But it wouldn't have been the right choice, and my father had never confused safety with righteousness. The parallel to my current situation crystallized with painful clarity. I could stay silent about David's betrayal, mind my own business, avoid the inevitable explosion that would follow any revelation. It would be easier, certainly less complicated. Emma might never discover the truth on her own. David was clearly skilled at deception, and Emma's trusting nature made her an easy target for his manipulation. But watching my daughter slowly lose herself to a man who held our family's values in contempt wasn't an option I could live with. Every day I stayed silent was another day David's poison worked deeper into Emma's psyche. Another day he convinced her that loyalty was naivete, and honor was obsolete. I picked up another photograph, this one showing Dad and his squad shortly after the bridge at Nijmegen. They looked exhausted but victorious, arms slung around each other's shoulders in the universal pose of soldiers who'd survived the impossible together. On the back, in Dad's careful handwriting, the men who taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision that something else is more important than fear. Something else is more important than fear. My father had written those words in 1944, but they felt like a direct message to me in 2024. My fear of disrupting Emma's marriage, of being seen as a meddling father, of the chaos that would unleash it, of that mattered more than protecting my daughter from a predator who'd already stolen too much of her light. I thought about the voice recording of David mocking Dad's Purple Heart, calling his sacrifice bad luck, rather than valor. David's dismissive attitude toward our family's military service wasn't just ignorance. It was a fundamental character flaw that revealed everything I needed to know about his capacity for respect, gratitude, and understanding. My father had risked his life for strangers because it was the right thing to do. How could I do less for my own daughter? The combat photographs went back into their protective sleeves, but their message remained crystal clear. Courage was inherited, passed down through stories and examples and moments when one generation shows the next what it means to stand up for what matters. Emma had temporarily lost sight of that inheritance, but it was still there, waiting to be reclaimed. David thought he was dealing with vintage patriotism and outdated values. He was about to learn that honor, loyalty, and the fierce protection of family weren't vintage anything, they were timeless. And they were about to be brought to bear against him with all the force my father had once brought to bear against fascists on a Belgian battlefield. The private investigator's business card felt substantial between my fingers, heavyweight stock, with embossed lettering that suggested competence and discretion. Margaret Reeves, licensed private investigator, 25 years of experience in matrimonial cases. A colleague at the university had recommended her after his own messy divorce, praising her thoroughness and her ability to build ironclad cases. Mr. McGrath, she'd said during our phone consultation, her voice crisp and professional, I need you to understand that once we start documenting your son-in-law's activities, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. The evidence we gather will paint a picture that your daughter will have to live with. Are you prepared for that responsibility? I'd assured her I was, but sitting in her modest office downtown, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer equipment, the weight of what I was setting in motion felt heavier than I'd anticipated. Margaret spread David's credit card statements across her desk, like a dealer laying out cards. Each transaction telling part of the story I already knew but needed. Documented. Restaurant charges on nights he told your daughter he was working late, she said, pointing to highlighted entries. Hotel stays during supposed business trips that don't correspond to any actual business meetings. Jewelry purchases from stores that specialize in gifts for mistresses, nothing fancy enough for a wife, but perfect for keeping a side piece happy. The clinical way she catalogued David's deceptions was both disturbing and oddly comforting. Margaret had seen this pattern hundreds of times before. There was nothing unique about David's betrayal, except the particular details of how he'd executed it. The voice recordings you've provided give us motive and character evidence, she continued. But we need more than pillow talk to build a comprehensive case. I'll need to document the affair with photographs, establish the timeline of deception, and most importantly, uncover the full extent of his financial fraud. Financial fraud. The phrase made my stomach clench. What do you mean? Margaret pulled out another folder, this one containing bank records that made my blood pressure spike. Your son-in-law has been systematically hiding assets from your daughter. The struggling business he's ascribed to her is actually quite profitable. He's been routing income through multiple accounts, claiming poverty while maintaining a very comfortable lifestyle, funded by what amounts to embezzled marital assets. The scope of David's deception was breathtaking. While Emma worked herself to exhaustion, believing they were barely staying afloat financially, David had been accumulating wealth in hidden accounts and spending it on his affair. Every extra shift she'd picked up, every small luxury she'd denied herself, every worried conversation about their future, all of it had been orchestrated by a man who could have eliminated their money stress at any time, but chose instead use Emma's financial anxiety as a tool of control. "How long will you need to document everything?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. 2 weeks for a basic case file. A month if you want enough evidence to ensure your daughter gets every penny she's entitled to in a divorce settlement. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Mr. McGrath, I've been doing this for a quarter century. I've seen a lot of betrayals. But the calculated cruelty of what your son-in-law has done to your daughter is remarkable even by my standards. This isn't just infidelity, it's systematic emotional and financial abuse." I thought about Emma's apologetic voice when she'd declined my offer to help with their mortgage, the way she'd praised David's work ethic, while he was actually spending their money on another woman. The guilt she carried for not being able to contribute more to their household, when she was already contributing everything she had. 1 month, I decided I want enough evidence to make sure Emma never has to see David again, unless she chooses to. Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good choice. And Mr. McGrath, your daughter is lucky to have a father who's willing to fight for her like this. Not everyone has someone in their corner who understands that sometimes love means being willing to be the bearer of bad news." As I left her office, Margaret's business card safely tucked in my wallet, along with the retainer receipt. I felt something I hadn't experienced since my father's war stories. The grim satisfaction of a battle plan coming together. David had made the mistake of underestimating his opposition. He thought he was facing a sentimental old man clinging to outdated values. He was about to discover he was actually facing the son of a Purple Heart recipient, who'd learned early that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. The graduation photograph on my mantle showed Emma at 22, radiant in her cap and gown, holding her nursing degree with the kind of pride that comes from earning something through genuine effort. Summa cum laude, president of her nursing honor society, recipient of the Dean's Award for Academic Excellence. The young woman in that picture had fire in her eyes and the world at her feet. That was before David entered her life. During her first year working at General Hospital, I remembered the early stories she'd tell about the charming consultant who'd been hired to streamline their patient management system. How he'd asked thoughtful questions about her work, praised her insights about patient care, made her feel valued and intelligent in ways that her demanding job sometimes didn't. "He really sees me, Dad," she'd said during one of our Sunday dinners, her face glowing with new love. "Not just as a nurse, but as someone with ideas worth hearing. He says I have a mind for management, that I could run a hospital department someday if I wanted to." The irony was devastating to contemplate now. David had identified Emma's intelligence and ambition, then systematically set about undermining both. The early encouragement had been replaced by subtle corrections, gentle suggestions that her ideas might be a bit naive, or not quite ready for prime time. He'd convinced her to turn down a promotion to charge nurse, because it would mean more stress, more time away from their relationship, more responsibility than she could reasonably handle. "David thinks I should focus on being really good at what I'm doing now, before taking on management responsibilities," she'd explained when I'd asked about the promotion. "He's probably right, I do tend to bite off more than I can chew sometimes." The transformation had been so gradual, so skillfully executed, that I'd barely noticed it happening. The confident young woman who'd once challenged my historical interpretations and offered sharp critiques of hospital administration had slowly been replaced by someone who prefaced every opinion with qualifiers and sought validation for thoughts she once would have stated as facts. But the strength was still there. I'd seen flashes of it during our recent family gatherings. Moments when David's manipulations were too obvious to miss entirely. Last month, when he'd interrupted Emma mid-sentence to correct her recounting of a difficult case at work, I'd watched her jaw tighten in a way that reminded me of my father, facing down a bully in basic training. "I think I can tell my own story, David," she'd said quietly, but with an edge that made him back down immediately. The granddaughter of a war hero was still in there, fighting to surface. She'd inherited her grandfather's sense of justice. It's what had drawn her to nursing in the first place. The desire to help people during their most vulnerable moments. She'd inherited his integrity too, which was why David's financial deceptions would hit her so hard once she learned the truth. But most importantly, she'd inherited his courage. Even if 5 years of systematic psychological manipulation had buried it. under layers of self-doubt and learned helplessness. I thought about the stories I'd told her as a child, about her grandfather's determination to protect his fellow soldiers no matter the personal cost, how he'd written in his journal that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing the right thing, even when fear threatened to paralyze you. Emma was afraid. I could see it in the way she flinched when David raised his voice, the way she apologized for taking up space in conversations, the way she'd trained herself to make herself smaller to avoid conflict. But fear could be overcome, especially when you had allies willing to stand with you and remind you of the strength you'd temporarily forgotten you possessed. The evidence Margaret was gathering would give Emma the information she needed to make an informed choice about her future. The recordings of David's mockery would show her exactly what he thought of her family's values. The financial documentation would prove that his manipulation extended far beyond emotional abuse into outright theft. But more than evidence, Emma would need to remember who she really was. Not the diminished version David had carefully crafted, but the brilliant, strong, compassionate woman who'd graduated summa cum laude and dreamed of changing the world one patient at a time. The woman in that graduation photograph wasn't gone. She was just waiting for someone to remind her that she'd never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. My father's war journal had been hidden in a false bottom of his footlocker for 70 years. Discovered only when I'd helped my mother clean out his things after the funeral. The leather-bound book, no bigger than a paperback novel, contained entries written by candlelight in foxholes, during brief respites between battles, in field hospitals where the wounded and dying outnumbered the beds. March 15, 1945. I read aloud in my study, my voice the only sound in the late evening quiet. Matthews is stable, but will lose the leg. Saw his wife's photograph fall out of his pocket when the medics cut away his uniform. Wedding picture, both of them so young and hopeful. Made me think about the choices we make when everything good hangs in the balance. The entry continued in my father's careful script. Captain Morrison asked me today why I pulled Matthews out instead of waiting for the medics. Told him it wasn't really a choice. When you see someone drowning, you either throw them a line or you watch them die. Either way, you have to live with yourself afterward. I'd rather live with the consequences of trying than the regret of standing by. Page after page revealed a moral philosophy I'd never fully understood from his war stories alone. This wasn't just about battlefield heroics. It was about the fundamental question of what we owe each other when the stakes are highest. Every entry circled back to the same theme. Sometimes protecting the people you love requires difficult action, even when that action comes with significant personal cost. April 3, 1945. Outside Berlin, another entry read, "Got a letter from Helen today. She's worried about me. Says she prays every night that I'll come home safe and unchanged. Don't have the heart to tell her that the man who left Iowa 18 months ago doesn't exist anymore. War changes you, but maybe that's not always a bad thing. Maybe some changes are necessary. Maybe some battles choose you instead of the other way around." I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of generational wisdom settling around me like a familiar coat. My father had faced impossible choices in wartime, but the principles that guided him weren't specific to combat. They were about recognizing when silence becomes complicity, when inaction becomes its own form of action. Emma was drowning, even if she didn't recognize it yet. David's systematic manipulation had pulled her so far under that she'd forgotten which way was up. Every day I delayed telling her the truth was another day she sank deeper into a life built on lies. Another day she lost more of herself to a man who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient source of income and domestic stability, while he pursued his real life elsewhere. But confronting David wasn't just about protecting Emmett, was about honoring the values my father had fought to preserve. David's mockery of the Purple Heart, his dismissal of our family's military service as vintage patriotism, his systematic assault on everything our family held sacred. These weren't just personal insults. They were an attack on the very principles that had shaped generations of McGraths. I thought about my father's words. Either way, you have to live with yourself afterward. I could live with Emma's anger if she initially blamed me for destroying her marriage. I could live with David's threats and accusations and attempts at retaliation. I could live with the chaos and pain that truth-telling would unleash. What I couldn't live with was standing by while my daughter was systematically betrayed and diminished by a man who held our family's core values in contempt. What I couldn't live with was letting Emma's grandfather's legacy be dismissed as pathetic nostalgia. by someone who had never sacrificed anything more significant than a weekend for another person's welfare. My father had written that some battles choose you, instead of the other way around. This battle had chosen me the moment I discovered David's recordings. The moment I realized the scope of his deception and cruelty. The question wasn't whether to fight it, was how to fight in a way that honored both my father's memory and my daughter's future. I opened the journal again, finding the entry I'd been looking for. The hardest part about doing what's right isn't the personal cost, it's trusting that the people you love will eventually understand why you had to do it. Sometimes love means being willing to be the villain in someone else's story until they're strong enough to see the whole truth. Emma might hate me initially for exposing David's betrayal, but eventually, when the shock wore off and the manipulation was revealed in all its calculated cruelty, she'd understand that sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is fight for his daughter's freedom, even when she doesn't know she needs rescuing. The war stories David found so tedious were about to become very relevant indeed. And this time, the battle would be fought not on foreign soil, but around my own dining room table. The digital voice recorder looked innocuous enough sitting on my kitchen counter, just another piece of modern technology, no bigger than a deck of cards. But it represented something my father would have understood instinctively: the importance of bearing witness, of preserving truth when lies threaten to overwhelm reality. Margaret had provided detailed instructions during our second meeting. "Place it here," she'd said, pointing to a spot on my dining room table diagram, "where it can capture conversation from all sides but won't be obvious to your guests. The battery will last for hours, more than enough for a family dinner. And, Mr. McGrath, once you start this recording, don't stop it, no matter what happens. The complete, unedited audio will be crucial if this ends up in divorce court." I'd tested the device 3 times, playing back conversations with myself, adjusting the placement until I found the perfect position behind my mother's old ceramic fruit bowl. The irony wasn't lost on me using the centerpiece my mother had chosen for family gatherings to document the end of my daughter's marriage. The plan was elegantly simple. Emma had already agreed to bring David for Sunday dinner, eager as always to maintain family traditions, despite David's obvious reluctance to participate. I would tell my usual war stories, but this time with deliberate focus on themes of honor, loyalty, and the consequences of betrayal. David, predictably, would become increasingly dismissive and disrespectful. Everything he said would be recorded, creating an audio record of his true character that even he couldn't dismiss or explain away. "You're sure about the timing?" Margaret had asked during our final planning session. "Once your daughter hears David's true opinions about your family, there won't be any going back to the way things were." I'd assured her I was ready, but sitting alone in my kitchen the night before the dinner, the magnitude of what I was orchestrating felt almost overwhelming. By this time tomorrow, Emma's marriage would be effectively over. Her world would be shattered, her trust destroyed, her future thrown into chaos. I would be responsible for all of it. But the alternative, allowing David to continue his systematic destruction of my daughter while mocking everything our family stood for, unacceptable. Emma deserved to know the truth about the man she'd pledged her life to, even if that truth would initially cause her tremendous pain. I thought about my father's journal entry, about throwing a line to someone who was drowning. Emma might not recognize that she was drowning, might even resist the rescue attempt. But that didn't change the fundamental reality of her situation. David's manipulation had been so complete, so skillfully executed, that she'd lost the ability to see her circumstances clearly. The voice recorder would serve the same function as my father's battlefield documentation, creating an indisputable record of events when emotions ran high and memories became unreliable. Years from now, when Emma had healed and rebuilt her life, she'd be able to listen to David's words and understand exactly what kind of man she'd been married to. I picked up the device, testing its weight in my palm. Such a small thing to carry such enormous consequences. But that's how the most important battles often worked. Not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with quiet acts of courage performed by ordinary people who understood that some things were worth fighting for. Tomorrow's dinner would be the culmination of weeks of investigation and planning. But more than that, it would be the moment when 3 generations of McGrath family values came to bear against someone who threatened everything we held sacred. My father had used bullets and bayonets to protect his fellow soldiers from fascists. I would use truth and technology to protect my daughter from a predator. The methods were different, but the underlying principle remained unchanged. When someone you love is under attack, you fight back with everything you have. using whatever weapons are available, regardless of the personal cost. David thought he was coming to dinner with his father-in-law, a sentimental old man who told boring stories about ancient history. He was actually walking into a carefully planned operation designed to expose him for exactly what he was: a fraud, a manipulator, and a coward who had built his comfortable life on the systematic betrayal of a woman who deserved so much better. Recorder went into my shirt pocket. Its weight, a comforting reminder that tomorrow, finally, Emma would learn the truth. The family dinner table had hosted 3 generations of McGrath celebrations, arguments, reconciliations, and revelations. My grandmother's mahogany table, inherited by my parents and passed down to me, bore the accumulated scars of decades of family life: water rings from countless glasses, knife marks from holiday turkeys, burn marks from hot serving dishes, placed too hastily during busy meals. Today it would serve as the stage for what I hoped would be Emma's liberation, though she didn't know it yet. I'd spent the morning preparing my father's favorite meal: pot roast with vegetables, the same recipe my mother had used to welcome him home from the war. The irony felt appropriate. Food that had once celebrated the end of one battle would now mark the beginning of another. The voice recorder sat hidden behind the ceramic fruit bowl, exactly where Margaret had recommended. I'd tested it one final time during breakfast, satisfied that it would capture conversation from every seat at the table. The battery indicator showed full charge for hours of recording capacity, more than enough for what I had planned. Emma arrived first, as I'd hoped she would. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal, her shoulders carrying the weight of too much responsibility and too little support. But she smiled when she hugged me, the same genuine warmth that had characterized her since childhood. "Something smells amazing, Dad," she said, hanging her coat in the front closet. "Is that Grandma's pot roast?" "Seemed like a good day for it," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "How was your week?" Emma settled into her usual chair, the same one she'd occupied since childhood, positioned so she could see both the kitchen and the living room. "Busy. I picked up 2 extra shifts this week. David's been working around the clock trying to land this new contract, and we could really use the overtime pay." Every word was a knife twist, knowing what I knew about David's hidden accounts and fabricated financial struggles. But I kept my expression neutral, making appropriate sympathetic noises, while internally rehearsing the script. I'd prepared for the evening's confrontation. "Where is David, anyway?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Margaret's surveillance had confirmed he'd spent the afternoon at a sports bar downtown, drinking with colleagues and complaining about having to endure another boring family dinner with the War Story Museum curator. "He'll be here soon," Emma said, checking her phone with the anxious expression of someone who'd grown accustomed to making excuses for her husband's lateness. "He got tied up with some last-minute client calls. You know how it is with his business. He can't really control when important calls come in." I nodded, suppressing the urge to tell her exactly how I knew David's business was doing and what he'd actually been doing all afternoon. Instead, I focused on the positive memories flooding back as I watched Emma move around my kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who'd grown up in this house. This was the woman who'd helped me research her grandfather's military service for my first published article about local World War II veterans, who'd spent countless hours as a teenager organizing his medals and documents, asking thoughtful questions about the historical context of his service, who'd once told me she wanted to work in military medicine because she felt a calling to help people the way her grandfather had helped his fellow soldiers. David's car door slammed in the driveway with unnecessary force, his usual passive-aggressive signal that he was here under protest. Emma immediately tensed, her body language shifting from relaxed to apologetic, in preparation for whatever mood her husband would bring into the house. "Sorry I'm late," David announced as he walked through the front door without knocking, his tone suggesting he was doing us a favor by showing up at all. "Got stuck on a conference call with a potential client in Seattle. Big opportunity. But you know how these West Coast guys are, they think everyone operates on their schedule." He kissed Emma perfunctorily on the cheek, the kind of obligatory gesture that spoke more to habit than affection. Then he turned to me, with the forced smile he'd perfected over 5 years of family dinners he clearly considered a waste of time. "Aldrich, good to see you. What's the occasion?" "Emma said you were making some special family recipe." "My father's favorite meal," I replied, watching his expression carefully. Seemed like a good time to honor his memory and share some of his stories. I've been going through his old journals lately, finding entries I'd never read before. David's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, just enough to confirm that Margaret's intelligence about his true feelings toward our family's military history was accurate. But he recovered quickly, settling into his chair with the resigned air of someone preparing to endure a tedious obligation. "Well," he said, reaching for the wine I'd opened to breathe, "I'm sure they're fascinating. Nothing like a good historical perspective to put modern problems in context." The recorder was capturing every word, every tone, every subtle indication of David's contempt for the evening ahead. As we gathered around the table that had hosted so many family memories, I felt the weight of 3 generations of McGrath tradition settling around us like armor. My father had faced enemies on foreign battlefields. Today, I would face one in my own dining room, fighting not with weapons, but with truth, armed with nothing more than love for my daughter and the courage to act when action was required. The real battle was about to begin. Asterisk. The Medal of Honor citation lay beside my father's Purple Heart on the sideboard, both documents carefully positioned where David couldn't miss them. I'd retrieved the citation from the National Archives years ago, but tonight it served a specific purpose: bait for the trap I was setting. "You know," I began, as we settled into our meal, "I discovered something remarkable while going through Dad's papers this week. Found out he was recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions at Nijmegen. Never told us about it, typical of his generation. Really, they didn't see heroism as something to brag about." Emma looked up from her plate with genuine interest, the same expression she'd worn as a child when I'd tell her bedtime stories about her grandfather's adventures. "Really? I thought the Purple Heart was the highest honor he received." "The recommendation was submitted," I continued, deliberately, catching David's eye, "but Dad refused to provide the detailed account they needed for the upgrade. Said he was just doing his job. That the real heroes were the men who didn't make it home." Classic example of the kind of humility and integrity that defined his generation. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language suggesting barely contained irritation. "That's quite a story," he said, his tone walking the line between polite interest and condescension. "Though I have to say, sometimes I wonder if that generation didn't make things more complicated than they needed to be. All that emphasis on duty and sacrifice. It's almost like they were afraid to admit they were just people doing a difficult job." The recording device captured every word, every inflection that revealed David's true feelings about military service and personal sacrifice. Emma frowned slightly, clearly uncomfortable with her husband's dismissive tone, but not yet ready to challenge him directly. "I think there's something beautiful about that kind of modesty," she said quietly. "Grandpa never acted like he was special, even though he clearly was. Remember the story about him carrying 3 wounded soldiers to safety? He always said they would have done the same for him." David set down his fork with just enough force to make his point. "But that's exactly what I mean. This endless romanticizing of wartime violence, it's not healthy. These were young men thrown into impossible situations by politicians who never had to face the consequences of their decisions. Calling it heroic doesn't change the fact that it was fundamentally tragic." I felt my jaw tighten, but forced myself to maintain the measured tone I'd practiced. "You're right, that war is tragic, David. But I think you're missing the point of why we honor these men's service. It's not about romanticizing violence, it's about recognizing that sometimes people have to make difficult choices to protect what they love." "Protect what they love," David repeated, his voice taking on the lecturing tone Emma had learned to flinch from. "Or protect what they'd been told to love by government propaganda designed to turn working-class kids into cannon fodder for imperial adventures." Emma's discomfort was now visible, her hands fidgeting with her napkin as she tried to navigate between her loyalty to her family's memory and her habit of deferring to her husband's opinions. "David, I don't think I'm just saying," David interrupted, warming to his theme, "that maybe it's time we moved beyond this whole cult of military worship. I mean, look at that Purple Heart over there. What does it really represent? A young man who got shot because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. We've turned random violence into some kind of sacred relic." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at her husband with an expression I'd never seen before, mixture of shock, hurt, and something that might have been the first stirring of real anger. The casual cruelty of his words, the dismissive way he'd referred to her grandfather's sacrifice as random violence, had finally pushed past her trained politeness. "That's my grandfather you're talking about," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "The man who raised my father, who built the life that made it possible for me to become a nurse, who taught our family what it means to put other people's needs before your own." That purple heart represents his blood, David. His willingness to suffer so other people could live. David's expression shifted slightly, perhaps recognizing that he'd pushed too far too fast. But instead of backing down, he doubled down with the kind of calculated cruelty that had characterized his entire relationship with Emma. Emma, honey, I understand why this family mythology is important to you emotionally. But at some point, we have to deal with reality, instead of clinging to outdated narratives about honor and sacrifice. The modern world requires different skills, different values. We can't keep living in the shadow of events that happened before we were born. The recording device captured it, all the condescending honey. The dismissal of our family's core values as mythology. The suggestion that Emma's reverence for her grandfather's service was childish nostalgia that needed to be outgrown. Most importantly, it captured the moment when something fundamental shifted in Emma's expression. For the first time in years, I saw a flash of the strong, principled woman she'd been before David's manipulation had taught her to doubt her own perceptions and values. The trap was working perfectly. David's true character was revealing itself with every word, and Emma was finally beginning to see the man she'd married for who he really was. My smartphone sat on the table like a loaded weapon, the audio file queued and ready to detonate David's carefully constructed world of lies. The moment had arrived. Emma was already questioning her husband's character after his dismissive comments about her grandfather, but she needed to hear the full truth about who she'd married. You know, David, I said, my voice deliberately calm. Since you seem to have such strong opinions about military service and family values, I think Emma should hear something that might interest you both. I came across some recordings recently that really capture the modern perspective on these old-fashioned concepts. David's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to something approaching alarm. He couldn't know what I had, but his survival instincts were clearly signaling danger. Recordings? Emma asked, looking between us with growing confusion. What kind of recordings? I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the play button. Voice messages. Actually, very revealing ones about how some people really feel about honor, loyalty, and the sacrifices our family has made over the generations. Dad, what are you talking about? Emma's voice carried a note of worry now, perhaps sensing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. David's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on my phone with the intensity of a man watching his execution. Being prepared. Aldrich, I'm not sure what you think you have. But I pressed play. Sarah's voice filled the dining room with crystalline clarity. I still can't believe some of the things you've told me about her family. A Purple Heart recipient. Really? And she actually takes that seriously. You're right, it's like being married to a museum curator. All those dusty old stories about honor and sacrifice. Emma's fork clattered to a plate, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror, as she heard her husband's mistress mocking everything she held dear. Thank God you're nothing like that. Sarah continued through the phone's speaker. I mean, who has time for all that vintage patriotism when there's real life to live? David lunged for the phone, but I held it away from him. My years of military fitness training finally proving useful in civilian life. Let her hear it all, David. She deserves to know who she married. David, Emma whispered, her voice breaking. On his name? Who is that? What is she talking about? David's voice filled the room next, his tone dripping with contempt. You should see her father's face when he starts telling those war stories. He actually tears up talking about his dad's medals. It's pathetic, really. All this worship of some old man's violence from 80 years ago. Emma's gasp was audible, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could somehow stop the words she was hearing. But I couldn't stop now. She needed to hear everything. Emma used to eat it up too, when she was younger. David's recorded voice continued. Thank Christ I've helped her see how irrelevant all that nostalgia is to actual modern life. Stop, Emma whispered, then louder. Stop. Turn it off. But the recording played on, capturing David's laughter as he described her grandfather's Purple Heart as representing bad luck rather than valor. His boasts about systematically alienating Emma from her family's values, his detailed descriptions of their affair and his plans for their future together. Emma's face had gone white, her breathing shallow as she listened to 5 years of marriage being revealed as an elaborate deception. Every kind word David had spoken about her family, every expression of respect for her grandfather's service, every supportive comment about her career ambitions, all of it had been performance, carefully calculated to maintain his comfortable life while he pursued his real interests elsewhere. The funniest part, David's voice continued from the phone, is how seriously they take themselves. Her grandfather's Purple Heart, Aldrich keeps it in this little shrine in his study like it's the Holy Grail, 3 bronze leaves or whatever, representing acts of valor beyond the call of duty. I looked it up once. You know what it really represents? Bad luck. The guy got shot. Multiple times. Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. She stared at David with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but something deeper and more dangerous. The look of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality was crumbling in real time. Emma, let me explain, David started, his voice desperate now that his carefully maintained facade was collapsing. Explain. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more force than any shout. Explain how you've been lying to me about everything for 5 years. Explain how you've been having an affair while I worked double shifts to support your fake financial problems. Explain how you've been systematically poisoning me against my own family, while pretending to respect them. The recording was still playing, Sarah's voice now describing their weekend plans and mocking Emma's exhaustion from working extra shifts to pay for David's secret lifestyle. Each word was another nail in the coffin of their marriage. Another piece of evidence that David's betrayal went far deeper than simple infidelity. Emma reached for the phone, her hands shaking as she stopped the playback. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing and David's desperate attempts to formulate some kind of defense. How long? She asked, her voice steady now with the kind of calm that comes after shock has burned away everything except the need for truth. How long have you been laughing at my family behind my back? How long have you been stealing from me? How long have you been planning to leave me for her? David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His usual manipulative confidence completely shattered by the undeniable evidence of his own words. The truth was finally out, and there was no going back. The divorce papers emerged from my briefcase like a magician's final reveal. The legal documents I'd had Margaret's attorney prepare in advance, now suddenly devastatingly relevant. Emma stared at them as I placed them on the table, her eyes still red from the tears that had come after the initial shock of hearing David's recordings. You knew, she said, her voice hollow with realization. You've known for weeks, haven't you? That's why you asked me to dinner tonight. That's why. You had those recordings ready to play. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to explain the agony of watching her suffer while I gathered evidence. The sleepless nights wondering if I was doing the right thing. The fear that she might never forgive me for destroying her marriage, even though that marriage had been built on lies. David, meanwhile, was cycling through the classic stages of a cornered manipulator. The shock had given way to desperate explanations, which had evolved into anger, and now he was attempting to regain control through intimidation. This is insane, he said, his voice rising as he gestured at the divorce papers. Emma, you can't seriously be considering throwing away 5 years of marriage because of some edited recordings and your father's paranoid conspiracy theories. He's been trying to break us up since the day we met. Emma's laugh was bitter, completely devoid of humor. Edited recordings. David, that was your voice, your words. Your girlfriend laughing about how stupid I am for taking my family's values seriously. Sarah isn't my girlfriend, David protested, the lie sounding pathetic even to him. She's a colleague. Those conversations were taken out of context. You know how workplace friendships can sound when, stop. Emma's voice cut through, his excuses like a blade. Just stop lying to me. I've heard enough lies to last several lifetimes. She picked up the divorce papers, scanning the first page with the focused attention of someone discovering that her entire life had been a carefully constructed fraud. The financial disclosure section seemed to particularly capture her attention, her eyes widening as she absorbed the scope of David's deception. $73,000. She read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. You have $73,000 in accounts I didn't know existed. While I've been working 16-hour shifts because you told me we were struggling financially. David's attempted explanation died in his throat as Emma continued reading, her nursing training serving her well as she processed complex information under extreme stress. Hotel receipts dating back 18 months. Restaurant charges for expensive dinners. On nights you told me you were working late. Jewelry purchases. She looked up at him with an expression of such profound disappointment that even I felt sorry for him for a moment. From stores that specialize in mistress gifts, apparently. The private investigator was very thorough in explaining the spending patterns. Private investigator, David's voice cracked on the words. You hired someone to spy on me. I hired someone to protect my daughter, I interjected, speaking for the first time since the recordings had finished playing. Someone needed to document the full extent of your betrayal, so Emma could make informed decisions about her future. Emma was studying the papers with the kind of intense focus she usually reserved for difficult medical cases. Her analytical mind working through the evidence methodically. The business trips to Chicago, Denver, Seattle, none of them were real, were they? You were here the whole time, with her. David's shoulders sagged as the weight of his exposed lies became unbearable. Emma, please. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I handled things poorly. But we can work through this. We can go to counseling. Figure out how to rebuild trust. Rebuild trust. Emma's voice rose for the first time all evening. You've been systematically lying to me about everything for our entire marriage. You've stolen money from our joint accounts to fund your affair. You've mocked my family's service and sacrifice while pretending to respect them. You've convinced me I was the problem when you were the one destroying our relationship from the inside. She stood again, this time with purpose rather than shock, and walked to the sideboard where her grandfather's purple heart sat in its place of honor. She picked up the medal, holding it in her palm like she was weighing its significance against everything she'd just learned. My grandfather earned this by risking his life to save other people, she said, her voice steady now with newfound clarity. He carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. Not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. That's what honor looks like, David. That's what sacrifice means. She turned to face him, the medal still clutched in her hand. You've spent 5 years teaching me to be ashamed of that legacy, to think of it as outdated nostalgia that has no place in the modern world. But you know what? My grandfather's values are exactly what I need right now. The courage to face difficult truths. The strength to do what's right even when it's painful. The integrity to choose principle over convenience. David made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Emma, if you file those papers, you'll lose everything. I'll fight you on every asset, every penny. I have lawyers too, and they'll make sure you understand the cost of listening to your father's poisonous threatening her now. I stood up, my own anger finally breaking through the careful control I'd maintained all evening. After everything you've done, you're going to threaten my daughter? Emma raised her hand, stopping me before I could say more. No, Dad, I've got this. She looked at David with the same clinical assessment. She might give a patient whose condition had just taken a turn for the worse. You can fight me if you want to, David. You can hire the best lawyers money can buy. But you're forgetting something important. She held up the divorce papers, pointing to a section near the bottom. All of this evidence, the recordings, the financial fraud, the systematic deception, it's all documented and verified. Your affair isn't just adultery, it's theft. Your lies about our finances aren't just betrayal, they're fraud. And your threats just now, they're going on record too. David's face went ashen as he realized the legal implications of what Emma was saying. Margaret had indeed been thorough, building a case that would protect Emma from any attempt at retaliation. So, here's what's going to happen, Emma continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally remembered her own strength. You're going to sign these papers. You're going to accept the settlement terms, which are actually quite generous, considering what you've done, and you're going to leave my family alone. She set the purple heart back in its place of honor, her gesture deliberate and symbolic. Because unlike you, we McGraths know the difference between right and wrong. And we're not afraid to fight for what matters. Emma's wedding ring made a tiny metallic sound as it hit the hardwood floor, rolling under the sideboard where her grandfather's purple heart had watched over our family for decades. The symbolism was perfect, and heartbreaking 5 years of marriage reduced to a small circle of gold spinning into darkness, while the symbol of genuine honor looked on from above. That felt better than I thought it would, Emma said, flexing her fingers as if testing their newfound freedom. The pale band of skin where the ring had lived told its own story of constraint and the obligation finally released. David stared at the ring on the floor like it was a live grenade, perhaps finally understanding that his marriage was truly over. That no amount of manipulation or threats could restore what his betrayal had destroyed. Emma, please. He tried one more time, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a child caught in an unforgivable lie. 5 years of marriage has to count for something. We had good times. We built a life together. Don't throw it all away, because of some misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. Emma's voice cut through his pleading like a scalpel. Is that what you call systematic financial fraud and emotional abuse? Misunderstandings. She walked to where David sat, her posture straight and strong in a way I hadn't seen since before their marriage. The woman who'd once apologized for taking up space in conversations was gone, replaced by someone who commanded attention through sheer force of moral clarity. "Let me tell you what I understand, David," she continued, her nurse's training evident in the way she delivered difficult news with compassion, but without equivocation. "I understand that you targeted me specifically because you thought I'd be easy to manipulate. Young, idealistic, raised on stories about loyalty and commitment that you could twist to serve your purposes." David's mouth opened to protest, but Emma held up her hand with the authority of someone who'd spent years managing difficult patients and their families. "I understand that you systematically isolated me from my family by making me ashamed of their values. Every time Dad would tell a story about Grandpa's service, you'd roll your eyes or change the subject, teaching me to see their pride as embarrassment. You convinced me that respect for sacrifice was naive, that honor was outdated, that loyalty was weakness." Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking these truths aloud was physically liberating her from years of psychological constraint. "I understand that you stole money from our joint accounts to fund your affair, while convincing me we were struggling financially. That every extra shift I worked, every small luxury I denied myself, every worried conversation about of it was orchestrated to keep me exhausted and dependent while you lived your real life with someone else." David's face had gone gray, his usual manipulative confidence completely shattered by Emma's clinical dissection of his behavior. He looked like a patient receiving a terminal diagnosis, desperate for some hope of reprieve that simply didn't exist. "But most importantly," Emma continued, her voice softening slightly as she looked toward me, "I understand that I forgot who I was. I forgot that I come from a family of people who do the right thing even when it's difficult, who protect the people they love even when it costs them everything, who choose truth over comfort and courage over safety." She retrieved her wedding ring from under the sideboard, holding the small gold circle up to the light. This ring was supposed to represent promises, faithfulness, honesty, mutual support, shared values. Instead, it became a chain that kept me bound to someone who held those promises in contempt. Emma walked to the kitchen and dropped the ring into the garbage disposal. The grinding sound it made as she flipped the switch, serving as a fitting eulogy for her marriage. "That's what I think of your promises, David," she said when the noise stopped. "That's what I think of 5 years of lies disguised as love." David made one final, desperate play for sympathy. "Emma, I know I made mistakes, but I do love you. Sarah doesn't mean anything to me. She was just a distraction, a way to deal with the stress of trying to build a successful business. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me." "Love," Emma's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You don't know what love is. Love doesn't mock the things that matter most to the person you claim to care about. Love doesn't steal from joint accounts to buy gifts for other women. Love doesn't systematically tear down someone's self-worth to make them easier to control." She gestured toward her grandfather's purple heart, still gleaming in its place of honor. "That's what love looks like. A man who risked everything to protect people he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. A father who documented his son-in-law's betrayal for weeks, gathering evidence to protect his daughter, even though he knew she might hate him for it. A family that values truth over comfort and chooses courage over convenience." Emma turned to me, her eyes bright with tears, but her voice steady with newfound strength. "Dad, I owe you an apology. For the past 5 years, I've been dismissing the stories that taught me who I was supposed to be. I let someone convince me that the values that built our family were embarrassing relics of a simpler time." She picked up the divorce papers, her signature already drying on the final page. But those stories weren't just history lessons, they were instruction manuals. Grandpa's journal entries about doing the right thing, even when it's terrifying. His willingness to risk everything to protect the people who mattered to him. His understanding that sometimes love means being willing to fight battles that others are too scared or too weak to fight themselves. Emma looked back at David one final time, her expression mixing pity with determination. "I'm not the same woman you married, David. Actually, that's not true. I'm exactly the woman you married, the one you've spent 5 years trying to change. The granddaughter of a war hero who taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is everything you thought you wanted." The transformation was complete. The woman who'd once flinched at her husband's raised voice now stood before him, like her grandfather had stood before enemy machine gun, less afraid, but determined, knowing the fight was righteous, even if the outcome was uncertain. David was no longer looking at his victim. He was looking at his judge, jury, an executioner, all wrapped in the deceptively gentle package of a woman who'd finally remembered that she came from a long line of people who didn't back down when bullies needed to be stopped. The house keys hit my dining room table with the finality of a gavel closing a court case. David's hands shook as he separated his keys from Emma's. The simple mechanical action somehow more devastating than any of the words that had been spoken. These keys had represented access to a life he'd built through systematic deception. And now that access was being revoked forever. "The spare key too," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found her strength and wasn't about to relinquish it. "The one you keep in your gym bag." David fumbled through his belongings, producing the additional key with the defeated air of a general surrendering his sword. 5 years of marriage, reduced to 2 pieces of metal, and a signature on legal documents. "Emma," he tried one last time, his voice breaking with what might have been genuine emotion, or might have been calculated manipulation with David. It was impossible to tell the difference. "When you've had time to think about this, when the shock wears off, maybe we could know." The word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of finality that spread through the room. "There is no maybe we could, David. There's no cooling off period, no trial separation, no couples counseling that can fix what you've done. You didn't make mistakes, you made choices. Hundreds of them, over years, all designed to betray and diminish me, while building your real life with someone else." David's face cycled through anger, desperation, and something that looked almost like relief. Perhaps part of him was exhausted from maintaining the elaborate deception, tired of pretending to be someone he wasn't for the sake of a woman whose values he'd never shared or understood. "You'll regret this," he said finally, his mask slipping, one last time to reveal the petty cruelty that had always lurked beneath his charming facade. "When you're working double shifts for the rest of your life to pay rent on some tiny apartment. When you realize what you threw away because your father filled your head with fantasy stories about dead heroes. Get out." I stood up, my own patience finally exhausted by David's inability to accept defeat with even a shred of dignity. "You've caused enough damage here. Take your threats and your self-pity and leave my house." But Emma raised her hand, stopping me. Before I could say more, "No, Dad. Let him finish. I want to hear what he really thinks, now that he doesn't have to pretend anymore." David looked between us, perhaps realizing that his final attempt at manipulation had backfired spectacularly. Emma wasn't cowering from his threats. She was studying them with the clinical interest of someone cataloging symptoms of a disease she'd finally learned to diagnose. "Go ahead, David," she encouraged, her voice steady and almost curious. "Tell me how I'll regret choosing self-respect over comfortable lies. Explain how working honest jobs to pay for a life built on truth is somehow worse than working myself to death to subsidize your affair. Help me understand why I should miss being married to someone who thinks my family's values are embarrassing fantasies." David's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air, his usual silver tongue finally failing him when he needed it most. The truth was that he had nothing left to offer her, no argument, no incentive, no reason why she should choose his version of reality over her own newfound clarity. "That's what I thought," Emma said when the silence stretched too long. "You've spent 5 years teaching me to doubt myself, to question my perceptions, to apologize for taking up space in my own life, but you never actually had any better alternatives to offer. You just wanted me smaller, weaker, more dependent, easier to control." She walked to the front door and opened it, the cool evening air carrying the scent of rain and new possibilities. "Your things will be packed and ready for pickup tomorrow afternoon. Don't come to the house, Al. Leave them on the porch. Any communication after that goes through lawyers." David gathered his coat and briefcase with the mechanical movements of someone still processing the complete destruction of his carefully constructed world. At the door, he paused as if he might make one final appeal, but Emma's expression stopped him cold. "Goodbye, David," she said simply. "I hope someday you figure out the difference between love and ownership, between partnership and predation. But that's not my problem anymore." The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the house like a church bell, tolling the end of an era. Through the window, we watched him walk to his car, his shoulders hunched against the weight of consequences he'd never imagined he'd have to face. Emma slumped against the closed door, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation finally ebbing. For a moment, she looked like the exhausted young woman who'd arrived for dinner just a few hours ago. But when she straightened up, I saw something new in her posture. Not just strength, but peace. "It's over," she said, the words somewhere between a statement and a question. "It's over, I confirmed, moving to hug my daughter for the first time in months, without feeling the weight of secrets between us. You're free. In my arms, Emma began to cry, not the desperate sobs of someone whose world was ending, but the cleansing tears of someone whose real life was finally beginning. Outside, David's car started and pulled away, carrying with it the last remnants of a marriage that had been doomed from the moment it was built on lies. The war was over, and Emma had won. My father's letters home sat in a neat stack on the coffee table between Emma and me, their yellowed envelopes bearing postmarks from places that had become legendary battlefields. We'd moved to the living room after David's departure, both of us needing the comfort of familiar surroundings as we processed the evening's revelations. I never asked to read these before, Emma said, her voice still hoarse from crying but steadier now. I was always so focused on the action stories, the bridge at Nijmegen, the wounded soldiers, the Purple Heart moments. I never thought about what he wrote to Grandma during the quiet times. I handed her the first letter, dated 3 weeks before the battle that would earn him his medal. He was different in these. More vulnerable, more afraid, but also more clear about what he was fighting for. Emma opened the envelope carefully, her nurse's training evident in the gentle way she handled the fragile paper. She read silently, for several minutes, occasionally gasping softly at particularly moving passages. "Listen to this," she said, finding a section that had clearly resonated with her. "My darling Helen, I know you worry that this war is changing me into someone you won't recognize when I come home. The truth is, it's not changing who I am, it's revealing who I was always meant to be. When everything you love is under threat, you discover reserves of strength you never knew existed. You learn the difference between what matters and what merely seems important." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. That's exactly what tonight felt like. Like I was discovering who I was always meant to be. I nodded, remembering my own reaction when I'd first read that letter years ago. "Keep reading. There's more," Emma continued. "I think about our future children sometimes. Helen, I wonder what kind of world we're building for them. What lessons they'll need to navigate the challenges we can't even imagine yet. I hope we can teach them that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act when the people you love are counting on you, even when you're terrified of the consequences." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the kind of understanding that comes from shared experience across generations. Emma folded the letter carefully and reached for another one. "Dad," she said as she opened the second envelope, "I need to apologize. Not just for tonight, but for the past 5 years. I let David convince me that your stories were embarrassing, that caring about honor and sacrifice was naive. I stopped seeing the wisdom in what you were trying to teach me. You don't need to apologize for being manipulated by an expert," I replied. David knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. He identified your natural empathy and used it against you, made you feel guilty for questioning his behavior, by framing your concerns as lack of trust or understanding. Emma was reading the second letter now, occasionally nodding as if my father's words from 80 years ago were speaking directly to her current situation. "He writes about loyalty here," she said. "True loyalty isn't blind obedience to someone who demands it. It's the conscious choice to stand by people who've earned it through their actions, not their words." She set the letter down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a child, learning a difficult but necessary truth. David demanded loyalty while giving none. He expected trust while offering only deception. He wanted me to stand by him while he was actively betraying everything I held sacred. The manipulation was sophisticated, I agreed. He didn't just lie to you, he convinced you to participate in your own diminishment. Made you feel like questioning him was a character flaw rather than a survival instinct. Emma picked up a third letter, this one written shortly after my father's wounding. "The hardest part about being in the hospital," she read aloud, "isn't the physical pain or even the fear about my future. It's watching other wounded soldiers who don't have families fighting for them. Men who face their recovery alone because they have no one who loves them enough to demand their healing." She paused, looking directly at me. "You fought for me tonight, didn't you? Even though you knew I might hate you for it initially." "Fighting for you was the only option I could live with," I replied. "Standing by while David destroyed you wasn't love, it was cowardice disguised as respect for your autonomy." Emma reached for the final letter in the stack, this one written after my father's return home. "My dearest Helen," she began, "I'm learning that coming home from war is its own kind of battle. Not just healing from physical wounds, but remembering how to be human again, how to trust that the world contains goodness worth protecting. The stories I'll tell our children someday won't be about the violence or the fear they'll be about. The moment I understood that some things are worth any sacrifice, that love sometimes requires us to risk everything we think we want for the chance to protect what actually matters. Emma set the letter down and leaned back against the couch, her expression peaceful for the first time in months. I want to start telling these stories again, she said. Not just reading them, but really understanding them, learning from them, teaching them to my own children someday. Grandpa would like that, I said. He always believed that the best way to honor sacrifice was to make sure the lessons lived on. Emma picked up her grandfather's Purple Heart from the coffee table where I had placed it earlier, holding the medal up to catch the lamplight. David was wrong about what this represents. It's not bad luck or random violence. It's proof that when everything good in the world is under attack, ordinary people can find extraordinary courage. She handed me the medal, her gesture deliberate and symbolic. I want you to keep telling the stories, Dad. All of them. And I want to help. I want to make sure that what happened to our family tonight, the courage it took to expose the truth, the strength it took to choose difficult honesty over comfortable lies, becomes part of our family legacy too. The Purple Heart felt warm in my palm, weighted with more than just bronze and history. It carried the accumulated courage of 3 generations of McGraths, each facing their own battles, each choosing to stand up for what mattered when the cost of silence became unbearable. Emma was right. Tonight's victory belonged in our family's collection of war stories, not because it involved violence, but because it proved that the values my father had fought for on foreign battlefields were still alive, still relevant, still powerful enough to defeat enemies who threatened the people we loved. The stories would continue, and Emma would be there to help tell them. The new family photograph sat on my mantle in the place of honor, showing Emma and me at her graduation from the nurse practitioner program she'd completed 6 months after her divorce was finalized. Her smile was radiant, genuine, unmarked by the careful politeness that had characterized her expressions during the David years. This was the real Emma, confident, accomplished, free. I still can't believe how different I look, she said, examining the photo during our weekly Sunday dinner. Not just physically, but in my eyes. There's something there that was missing for so long. Light, I said simply. You look like yourself again. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Within weeks of David's departure, Emma had begun reclaiming aspects of her personality that had been suppressed during their marriage. She'd started asking questions again during our family history discussions, offering insights and challenging interpretations the way she had as a child. She'd applied for the nurse practitioner program she'd been too busy to consider while married. Most importantly, she'd begun to trust her own perceptions and judgments again. I got a letter from David yesterday, she mentioned casually, serving herself more of the pot roast that had become our Sunday tradition. His lawyer wants to discuss the possibility of reduced alimony payments. Apparently, his business isn't doing as well as expected since his affair became public knowledge. How do you feel about that? I asked, though her expression suggested she'd already reached a decision. Like it's not my problem anymore, she replied with a smile that held no bitterness, only peace. He made his choices. Now he gets to live with the consequences. I'm not his safety net anymore. Emma had indeed thrived in the aftermath of her divorce. The settlement had been generous. Margaret's evidence had made David's position untenable, and his lawyers had advised him to accept terms rather than face a public trial that would expose the full extent of his financial fraud and emotional abuse. Emma had used her portion to pay for nursing school and buy a small house near the hospital, where she now worked as a charge nurse in the cardiac unit. I've been thinking about starting a support group, she said, cutting into her roast, with the precise movements of someone accustomed to detailed work. For healthcare workers dealing with domestic manipulation, you'd be surprised how common it is partners who use our natural empathy and helping instincts against us. The idea didn't surprise me at all. Emma had always been drawn to helping professions, but her experience with David had given her unique insight into the psychology of abuse and recovery. She was uniquely qualified to help others recognize the warning signs she'd missed in her own marriage. Your grandfather would be proud, I said, raising my water glass in a small toast. Using your painful experience to help others, that's exactly the kind of service he would have understood. Emma smiled, but then her expression grew more serious. Dad, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I set down my fork, giving her my full attention. Always, during those weeks when you were gathering evidence about David, was there ever a moment when you considered not telling me? When you thought maybe ignorance would be kinder? The question hit me harder than I'd expected, bringing back all the sleepless nights I'd spent weighing Emma's immediate happiness against her long-term welfare. Every day, I admitted, watching you work yourself to exhaustion, while praising David's supposed sacrifices, it would have been easier to let you live in that illusion than to destroy your world with the truth. Emma nodded thoughtfully. What changed your mind? What made you decide that the truth was worth the pain it would cause? I thought about my father's journal entries, about the letters home describing his philosophy of protective action. I realized that protecting you from David's betrayal wasn't actually protecting you at all, it was enabling your destruction. Every day I stayed silent was another day he convinced you that your perceptions were wrong, that your family's values were embarrassing, that you were the problem in your relationship. And another day I lost more of myself, Emma added quietly. I understand now why you had to do it. The woman I was becoming under David's influence, she wasn't me. She was his creation, designed to serve his needs while slowly disappearing. As an independent person, we ate in comfortable silence for a while, both of us reflecting on how dramatically our lives had changed since that confrontational dinner 6 months ago. The dining room felt different now, lighter somehow, free from the tension that had characterized our family gatherings during the David years. I want to continue the family tradition, Emma said suddenly. The war stories, the history preservation, all of it, but I want to expand it too. Include stories about different kinds of courage, the strength it takes to leave an abusive relationship, the bravery required to rebuild your life from scratch, the heroism of ordinary people who refuse to let others diminish them. The idea was perfect, a natural evolution of our family's commitment to honoring courage in all its forms. We could start with your story, I suggested. The granddaughter of a war hero who fought her own battle for freedom and won. Emma laughed, but there was pride in the sound. I like that. The McGrath family chronicles, stories of courage across the generations. We could document everything: Grandpa's war service, your decision to investigate David, my journey back to myself. Show how the same principles apply, whether you're fighting fascists on a foreign battlefield or predators in your own dining room. As we cleared the dishes together, I thought about the full circle our family had traveled. My father had fought to preserve freedom and democracy against external enemies. I had fought to preserve my daughter's autonomy against a domestic threat. Emma had fought to reclaim her identity after years of systematic psychological warfare. Each battle had been different in scope and method, but all had been guided by the same fundamental principle. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. You know what the best part is? Emma said as we loaded the dishwasher. I'm not angry anymore. Not at David, not at myself for falling for his manipulation, not even at the 5 years I lost to his lies. I'm grateful. Grateful, I asked, surprised by her choice of words. Grateful that I learned the difference between love and control. Grateful that I discovered my own strength before it was too late. Grateful that I come from a family that taught me it's never too late to fight for what matters. She hugged me tightly, and I felt the solid presence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. Most of all, she continued, grateful that I had a father who loved me enough to risk being the bearer of bad news when good news would have been easier. Outside, the sun was setting over the neighborhood where Emma had grown up, where she'd learned about honor and sacrifice through stories told around this same dinner table. But this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Tomorrow, Emma would return to her job healing others. I would continue my research and writing, preserving the stories that defined our family's character. And together, we would build on the legacy my father had established, proving that courage isn't vintage or outdated, it's timeless, renewable, and more powerful than any force that tries to diminish the human spirit. The war stories would continue, because the need for courage never ends. But now we had a new story to tell about a father and daughter who faced down a different kind of enemy and emerged victorious. Their bond stronger than ever, their values intact, their future bright with possibility. Some battles choose you, some stories demand to be told, and some family legacies are worth any sacrifice to preserve.